Their seats, please. Okay, well, I'd like to welcome everybody to the Phoenix Center's 9th annual U.S. Telecom Symposium. I'm really amazed that this is our 9th one, and I'm really glad everybody could show up here. Get the mic tuned there a little bit. We have a really phenomenal program lined up today, and I really appreciate everybody coming out. So to begin, I always like to start the Phoenix Center Symposium with a quick sort of state of the Phoenix Center, what we've done this year, and we've had a couple of things. We've done 11 publications, which I think is a tremendous amount of research. We've done some interesting work on network neutrality, special access, a really interesting paper that we just did about a month ago on internet use and depression among the elderly. I think this is the first paper that shows with empirics how internet use actually reduces depression. And we had an event here about a month, 6 weeks ago, and the elderly community was just absolutely thrilled by this because it was the first paper. So that's also available on our website. We did a broadband adoption index for the governments of Portugal and Brazil. Had a big event in July about this. There's been a lot of discussion about, U.S. rankings, and what's interesting about that project is that the U.S. is not the only country that's upset about their rankings, and we started this process with our research about 2 years ago where we did a paper called the Broadband Performance Index, which we said, look, the question is not where you rank, but where should you be ranked given your demographic and economic endowments, and it got written up on the Economists, and we're all very excited, and Portugal, turned out, had scored very well in our index, and they've done very poorly in the OECD. We always joked, I wonder if the Portuguese would ever call us up. And about 9 months after the paper came out, I'm in my office, the phone rings. Hello, I'm the government of Portugal. This paper's terrific. Wow. Would you like to come over and present? Okay, so I sent the guy with the accent, George, over to Portugal, and they had a whole conference, and it was really phenomenal because they have a 3-person commission. 2 of their commissioners are PhD-level economists, and usually expect when you go to these type of events that the head of the regulator shows up and says, thank you very much, it's very interesting, I got to go have lunch. And these guys sat in the back and grilled George for 2 hours. Like, how'd you get that number? What'd you use that? And it was really interesting, and they had this problem. So they commissioned us to do this project, the Broadband Adoption Index, which rather than typical rankings, it focuses on establishing targeted benchmarks based on the social value that you assign to various internet access technologies. We're very proud that that paper is actually going to be published in March. So that's the other thing. And the other thing we've done this year, and I think it's been very useful, is to provide what I would describe as a peer review service. These issues, as you all know, are exceedingly hard and exceedingly complex. And I think while it's really great to have everybody talk about it, let's have ideas and new ideas. At the end of the day, good, serious work matters. And what we've tried to do, and some of our papers are outside that we've done this, is go, at the end of the day, you need good technique. And I think by calling flaws in analysis is a completely legitimate and indeed important thing, and we've been trying to do that a lot by trying to bring the debate back to first principles to get a discussion of what exactly are we doing here. What else have we done? So we've had 6 papers either accepted for publication or actually published in academic journals this year, which is a tremendous achievement. Couple of op-eds. We've testified all over the place. We've done quite a bit of international work. As I said, George and I were in Lisbon in February for an OECD workshop to present the research that we did. I just got back from Bermuda. And the other really big thing is staff changes. As many of you know, our co-founder, Tom Kautsky, went over to work for the Broadband Task Force, and we miss Tom very much. But I think what a lot of people don't know is that it's just more than just Tom, George, and myself. We have 2 exceptionally talented PhD economists who are down at Auburn, Randy Beard and Michael Stern. These guys are just tremendous people, and they've actually come on a much more full-time basis. They've gone from adjunct fellows to senior fellows, and without their contribution, their work, it's really helped our productivity. And also, keeping things in the family, we've also brought as a visiting scholar George's sister-in-law, Dr. Sherry Ford. They have lots of PhDs in the Ford family, apparently. And she came on as a visiting scholar and helped write the depression paper, so we're very pleased about that. So then moving down to what we're going to talk about today, We have, as I said outside, a really terrific. I think the first thing, we're going to start with our traditional economist panel. We've brought together some of the really the best in the business, and we're very excited about that. Commissioner Baker will be here for a morning keynote. And then our second panel will be one comprised of people who actually run networks for a living, to talk about what, with all this talk about reasonable network management, cybersecurity. I thought it was important to hear people who actually did this for a living, and I'm really excited about that. And then we're going to wind up today with our presentation of our annual Duval Award to Congressman Butterfield. So without further ado, again, I appreciate everybody coming out. Let's bring up the Economists and start the symposium. Quick administrative note, I know telling telecom people, please turn off your cell phones. Thanks. Jonathan. Bobby. Panel can converge. Okay, very good. All right. Good morning. I'm pleased to welcome you to the Economist Roundtable, which is a panel convened each year for the annual Phoenix Center Telecom Symposium. As we've done in past years, each participant is invited to make a short presentation on a topic of interest to the telecom policy community. The topics are selected by the presenters and reflect the views of the presenters and not necessarily the views of their affiliated academic institution, government, or other professional associations. The Phoenix Center is pleased to present an especially distinguished panel of economists this year. Each economist, as Larry has indicated, is a recognized expert on economics, telecom policy, competition, or antitrust. Each panelist has authored numerous papers on some aspects of the economics of telecom or competition policy. Bibliographical details about each of our speakers this morning are provided in the conference materials, so in the interest of time, I will simply introduce our panelists and their current affiliation and their impressive bibliographies are found in the conference materials. Appearing on the panel this morning are, first, Dr. Mary Swartz, currently Professor of Economics at Georgetown University, and this will be the order in which they will appear this morning on the panel. Secondly, Dr. Jonathan Baker, who is currently Chief Economist at the Federal Communications Commission and Professor of Law on leave at the Washington College of Law at American University. Thirdly, Dr. Robert Willig, currently Professor of Economics and Public Affairs at Princeton University. And finally, Dr. George Ford, who is Chief Economist at the Phoenix Center. Following the presentations, questions from the audience will be accepted. We'll try to let the presenters make their presentations and defer questions to the end if we can. And of course, our panelists are welcome to comment on the presentations of their colleagues. So, without further ado on my part, Maurice.
Thanks, Jerry. Thanks for inviting me. It's always a pleasure to be here. Test this. It works good. All right. So, I'm not Jerry Duval. Okay. The remarks I'm going to give today are virtually identical to remarks that I gave at an FCC panel in October about broadband competition and deployment. My sense was that that panel might have something to do with the NPRM that they were planning to put out, and indeed there has been an NPRM on net neutrality. So what I'm going to say here is relevant to that, although I'm not going to get into the details of the NPRM. The recent NPRM, one of the proposals in there is that broadband ISPs may not be allowed to charge for prioritized or enhanced access, and to charge content or application providers for prioritized or enhanced access to end users. Now, anytime you impose a regulation, you want to limit flexibility, and so economic theory as well as past experience suggests you can expect significant costs, and I doubt that this is going to be any exception. So it's never too late to ask, is there a compelling need to intervene in the first place? And that's kind of where I want to take it. Which gets you into the threshold question of what should be the standard for thinking about intervention. My view is that you should only consider access regulation in any industry, whether it's broadband or elsewhere, only if two things are met. One is there's clear evidence of a serious competitive failure. And secondly, there's a reasonable prospect that regulation can make things better. Condition one is basically a screen. You want some evidence of serious failure, because if you set the bar too low, there's always somebody who will complain about something in any industry. It invites rent seeking and so forth. You also want clear evidence because of the type 1 problem, convicting the innocent. Next, you also want reasonable prospects of success. That's what my old professor at UCLA, Harold Bensitz, used to call resist the nirvana approach to economic policy. The nirvana approach says that just because the market isn't perfect doesn't mean the government can do better. Okay. So that's all obvious stuff, but it's fair to say, do we have evidence that either of these conditions hold in broadband access today? And I have 3 slides on each of these points. You probably won't get through all of them, but that's fine. How do I move this thing? Yeah. I'll talk to the next slide. The next one is short, so what I'm going to do is any questions I need to know about? Okay. Like some better. The broadband competition, right? So the interventionist view in the past has focused on the wireline, the landline, mass market broadband, claiming it's largely a durable duopoly of the local cable and telephone company. And I think there are 2 responses to that. One, on a structural issue, the premise that it's a durable duopoly is questionable. And on the conduct issue, even a duopoly can exhibit strong rivalry. So I think it's wrong to say duopoly is just one removed from monopoly, therefore we should treat it just like monopoly. There's a big difference between duopoly and monopoly. Okay. Is broadband a durable duopoly? Well, there are pockets of competition even in wireline broadband, like RCN in the district, for example, but I don't want to overstate that. We may supply fiber and so on. The bigger issue, I think, is that broadband wireless is emerging. The FCC's recent notice predicts that that's going to be quite a force in a fairly short period of time. And potentially that's more important. I'd quite like to be more important. The one big point I want to make on this, people will say, well, yes, but mobile will never be a good substitute for fixed because of bandwidth and so on. Well, maybe not. There's trade-offs. Mobile has advantages of mobility. Many users may be willing to trade off the mobility advantages against the bandwidth. And the big point is that's the same as what we said about wireless cell phones. That will never be a substitute for landline voice, and guess what happens several years later? It is. People are cutting off their landlines. So, looking at this industry, I would say you don't want to assume that broadband, broadly defined, is a global duopoly because wireless is coming in. Now, the FCC in its recent order says, well, we'll regulate wireless as well. It sounds to be a little bit radical. Now, if you do view the universe as fixed plus mobile, that's my last bullet, then in most localities, there will be 5 or 6 competitors. And the way I come up with that is, in a locality, you're going to have the local cable company and the local ILEC. If the local ILEC is Verizon or AT&T, you still have 3 wireless mobile providers that are not affiliated with them. If the local ILEC is not Verizon or AT&T, then you have 4. So that's how you come up with the 5 or 6. Well, that's not a bad market structure in terms of, based on past presumptions. Broadband access regulation. Oops. Sorry, did I miss one? No, conduct indications of rivalry. I missed one. On the conduct point, I mentioned it. I don't want to get into price patterns and so on. That's all hard. If you do that right, you have to control to what happened to costs and so on and so forth. But there's some obvious indications that anybody can understand of that these are not staid, collusive industries. On the technology front, there's evidence of upgrades in response to competitors. So casual evidence today suggests that the areas where the cable companies are upgrading to DOCSIS 3.0 first are areas where they already have competition from either Verizon's Fios or AT&T's Uverse. That's interesting. You have similar experience in mobile. You have comparative advertising. In landline broadband, you have Comcast calling DSL the slow skis, those turtles. Verizon making fun of the cable guy and all that stuff. No, you wouldn't be doing comparative advertising if you were not competing. Similar in mobile, fastest network versus more reliable network. There's an app for that, there's a map for that. Sound familiar? Okay. Let me skip the Apple's iPhone exclusive. It's an interesting point if you have time to come back to it. I'm going to claim that the Apple's exclusive content is actually evidence that wireless is competitive, or that there's strong competition there. All right. Broadband access regulation. All right. The big point here is, at least the FCC notice, they cite the record of intervention in the past against the regulated monopoly AT&T system. And in a regulated monopoly environment, there are strong reasons why you might expect anti-competitive discrimination against rivals in adjacent markets, and why it may make sense for regulation to step in. These are pretty exceptional cases. But the big point is you cannot take that historical record and assume that you have the same incentives and the same ability, you meaning a broadband access provider, to exclude competitors from adjacent markets. It's just a different set of facts. That's the first one. And I flesh out the details of that, which I won't have time to get into today, but most of these are points I think are familiar to people here. The third bullet I would like to stress, which is you'd like to see some evidence of serious anti-competitive discrimination before you say, okay, let's regulate. And the 2 examples that keep getting cited are Madison River in 2005 and the recent Comcast proceeding, which somewhat controversial. And in any case, the FCC put an end to it pretty fast. So I would say if you're looking for the traditional historical rationale for access and prevention, which is anti-competitive discrimination, so far, that presents a weak case for preemptive regulation. It may make sense to watch it and stem it at the right time, but not put preemptive rules. The other sets of arguments have been offered that we may worry about broadband access providers price discriminating against certain content application providers, or even without price discrimination based on heterogeneity. We're just worried about raising prices to content or access providers, period, and extracting rents from them and reducing innovation. This falls in the category of two-sided markets analysis. None of these arguments give you a clear basis or strong basis for intervening. For example, the two-sided markets point. If broadband provides a rate to charge content providers for the right to access end users, economic theory predicts that broadband providers would find it in their interest to reduce prices to consumers. And, that's usually not viewed as such a terrible thing. There's evidence of that as well. When AOL decided it was going to shift its business model towards getting more money from advertisers, what it did was eliminate fees to subscribers. Well, why is that? It's exactly this theory. Because if you're making more money from advertisers, your gain from attracting consumers expands. And the way to attract consumers is to cut the price. And of course, there's lots of good reasons for why you may have tailored priority pricing, different options, and to try to disentangle the efficiency reasons for these things from the bad reasons is by no means easy. Okay. Which leads me to the last point. I think that in this particular space, even if you believe that regulation has a role, it tends to do better when the environment is pretty stable, pretty simple. Here we're dealing with a space that's both complex and changing, both technologically and in the types of business arrangements. So just a priori, this does not look like an industry that's a good candidate for successful regulation.
Good morning, everyone. I am delighted to be here and pleased to discover that the Public Service Award that the Phoenix Center gives out is named for Jerry Duvall, who's the chief economist of the FCC's Media Bureau, and then to learn that Jerry is the honorary chief economist emeritus at the Phoenix Center, and then to find that Jerry himself is moderating this panel. What more could I ask for? Well, I'm, as Jerry said before, I'm speaking today for myself, not for the FCC. And of course, I've only worked at the FCC for 3 months. And the various things that I'm involved with are not yet where it would be appropriate to comment and go on them. So I'm not going to discuss particulars of rulemakings or other proceedings we're involved in. Instead, what I want to do is talk in a general way about an important economic force that's relevant to many specific matters, potential competition. And I'll use some hypothetical examples involving wireless internet access, which I think that Marius and Bobby are talking about as well, to make my discussion more concrete. But I'm only using them to suggest the type of questions that interest me and not to signal anything about what the Commission might be thinking about doing. Got it? So potential competition issues arise in a number of legal settings at the FCC, including merger reviews, forbearance decisions, and rulemakings. And across these settings, there are two general economic issues. One is exclusion, which arises when there are concerns that incumbents are or could harm competition by excluding potential rivals. Rise in the potential competition case, at any rate, whether the exclusion is through conduct or through merger. And potential competition also matters when we're thinking about fostering competition, when we're considering proposals to aid the development of promising new technologies, particularly when we're seeking to introduce more competition into industries that were historically regulated monopolies. Now, you can't treat potential competition with a broad brush. Its significance as an economic force in any particular industry depends on a range of factors that we need to evaluate. And I've listed some of them on the slide. What are the characteristics of the products and services that potential competitors would offer? For example, wireless internet access uses a different technology and has different costs and different product attributes from wireline service, and so it might be a better substitute for some customers and for some uses than for others. How far from entering are the potential rivals, and what steps would they need to take? So the greater the time and sunk investments that are required for entry, the less the potential rivals are likely to serve as competitive constraints on incumbent firms. How are incumbent firms likely to respond in the event of entry? The prospect of an aggressive incumbent response can discourage potential rivals from making the necessary investments. How would a potential rival likely act after entry? Entrants may prefer to join the club than to rock the boat, or they could decide to commit to niche competition in order to avoid provoking a competitive response, rather than making the industry more competitive, or substantially more competitive. And what's the extent of actual rivalry in the industry? The less we see actual competition, the more we might care about fostering potential competition. It's possible to imagine a perfectly contestable market in which the sole incumbent performs competitively, and Bobby has imagined this for us in his articles, but it somehow doesn't seem to appear frequently in the real-world markets that get the attention of competition policymakers. Well, these kind of questions can be difficult to answer because we know less about the future than the past. But they're no different in kind from the kind of questions that the antitrust agencies and courts have to answer in analyzing entry conditions and evaluating whether new competition would cure competitive problems from merger. Relative to the Justice Department and the Federal Trade Commission, both agencies where I've worked in the past, the FCC has two institutional advantages in analyzing potential competition in communications. Well, the first is it places a greater emphasis on rulemaking rather than adjudication, which can lead us to look more broadly at the way an industry works and let us contemplate a broader set of possible regulatory options that might be available during adjudication. The emphasis on rules does bring with it a disadvantage, though, because we generally have less ability to compel discovery or rely on confidential information or test evidence in an adversarial setting than would be true in adjudication. And the second institutional advantage is in the FCC's deep communications industry expertise, which lets us make better judgments about potential competition than an agency without that expertise would be able to do. There is a general concern in the economic and political science literature about the possibility that an industry-specific regulator would act more in the interests of the industry than the public, and that's the potential downside of having an industry-focused regulator with expertise. But I have already seen how Chairman Janikowski's emphasis on transparent and data-driven decision-making encourages us to harness our expertise for the public interest. So there is so I'm hopeful that our expertise will be used for the good, at least while I'm with the agency. So now, when anti-competitive exclusion is alleged, whether it involves potential rivals or actual rivals, the FCC analyzes competition issues in the same way that the Federal Trade Commission and the Justice Department Antitrust Division would analyze them. Key issues are whether incumbents or conduct excludes, whether it raises costs or creates difficulties reaching the market. And then second, whether the incumbent or incumbents obtain market power as a result or maintain existing market power. And third, whether the conduct has offsetting efficiency benefits. Now, in various legal contexts, including spectrum management and media ownership rules, the FCC conducts a broader public interest review. That might lead us, for example, to think about fostering democratic participation and diversity of voices in some subject. But I'm not going to discuss issues involving potential competition that might go beyond economic competition today. I'm sticking with economic stuff. So finally, let me sketch some examples of possible issues involving potential competition with wireless service for data transmission. The wireless providers could be fixed or mobile, they could be terrestrial or satellite. I'm not worrying particularly about that right now. Now, this wireless is a possible example of potential competition, and Marius was emphasizing something similar, because it could offer potential competition with wireline service. Today, wireless service and wireline services are largely complements for data transmission. What Marius was talking about earlier in his slide was voice. If the wireline prices rise, few broadband users will cut back their wireline minutes and shift them to wireless or cut the cord entirely. But there is potential for wireless broadband providers to substitute for wireline broadband, at least for some users and some uses, depending on how technologies and prices change and on what applications and services are developed. But you have to think about the details here. This may be more likely for customers whose applications don't demand the highest bandwidth, or those who value mobile service highly and don't like shifting devices. Costs and technologies and applications will likely change over time, so it's important for the FCC to collect data routinely to help us keep up to speed on these changes, and we are actually thinking about how to do that. Let me describe a potential exclusion issue with potential competition involving wireless, namely the possibility that a wireline provider could use the pricing of special access lines connecting the wireline network to the wireless provider's tower. This is tower backhaul. In order to raise the cost for a terrestrial wireless provider and make it less competitive for a wireline service, which might particularly be attractive as a business strategy if it makes the wireless service less competitive with the less competitive with the wireless service of a provider that's affiliated with a wireline firm. Now, even if this is going on, and I'm not, saying that necessarily this is illustrative, I don't know how significant it would be relative to other possible disadvantages that wireless firms might face in competing with wireline providers, customer base, or the bundle other services or whatever. So this discussion is intended to just be theoretical. It's going to give you a sense of what I'm talking about. And I also want to describe a possible issue of potential competition involving the development of a promising technology. If the Commission thinks that wireless providers offer a promising approach for providing broadband to those who are not served today, it could consider facilitating it by allocating more spectrum to wireless or allowing spectrum owners generally more flexibility in using or trading spectrum. And we're talking about spectrum allocation in the Commission now. In other contexts, the Commission might facilitate the development of a promising new technology in other ways, perhaps at the standard setting, to reduce transaction costs of coordination and any associated delay. Well, because I'm new to the FCC, I have emphasized the hypothetical Commission actions. This has been a potential talk about potential competition. But I hope I can return in some future year and talk about the ways the FCC has actually promoted competition, potential or otherwise, while I've been at the agency. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. Bobby?
Okay, which is the right button? Right. Where's your forward button? Well, good morning. You're all doing very well, I see. I'm used to teaching school children who are getting younger and younger all the time. You folks, you're not looking at your Facebook as far as I can tell. Maybe some of you are, maybe you are. It's always an issue in the classroom. I think Jonathan was playing with this actually as he was doing his slideshow. But thank you for sitting still, and I hope that you will remain so for the next 12 or 40 minutes until I finish. So you see my subject, that's the last slide you'll be able to actually read. The purpose of the slides is to show you that not only is there a written version that you're welcome to ask for, there's also a slideshow, which is more condensed than the written report, and you're welcome to ask for that too. Let's see if this works. Oh, it does. This is great. As you know, the FCC annually prepares an assessment of competition in the wireless industry. And this year, the NOI, John, you call it that? This is before your time, last summer, right? Was particularly interesting to me and to others with my mindset, because it actually asked for what appears to be help in what seemed to me to be the key issues about such assessments, not only in wireless but in other areas of oversight by the FCC. And that is, the FCC asked for views on what would be a proper analytic framework for the assessment of competition, with particular attention to things like the market factors and the data that should be collected, I think as John alluded to, that would help facilitate the Commission's assessment of competition and consumer welfare in various markets within the FCC's jurisdiction. And of course, this is crucial because, at least if the FCC listens to John and to Marius, and no doubt to George as well, the FCC will withhold the exercise of its power over the microcosm of business decision-making if there is an assessment that in the area of possible regulation, competition is working pretty well. One hopes for that kind of discipline, and I think our Commission is up to it under John's guidance, if they'll listen to him, which he hasn't confessed that they will yet, but someday we'll hear that. Jerry, you're in charge, right? So I submitted a report on this subject, and I can share a copy of that with you. This is the table of contents of that report, and this is why I need 40 minutes instead of 12 or 20. If I had all morning, I would explain that the report does cover what would be an economically sound assessment of competition, starting at the level of methodology and also throwing facts that are relatively publicly known about the wireless industry into the categories that my methodological suggestions delineate as the way to structure the analysis. The second part of the report does the same thing, but in the slightly more difficult area, perhaps, of the interesting vertical relationships in the wireless industry, dealing with the sets, the instruments themselves, and the software these days, exclusivity relationships that economists call vertical, even though, do they come from the sky? I guess they do. It's vertical. And then finally, in my report, I apply all of these ideas to an assessment of some of the ideas that are floating around for regulatory intervention in these markets, and linking my views on what would be appropriate to the exercise of the competition assessment. So I do all that, and I can't but hope to skim over this in a very speedy way today. The Commission's mandate, I'm going to focus on the methodology part because it comes first, and I'll probably run out of time, and Jerry, I count on you to tell me when 20 minutes is up or so. It's not funny, John. I told jokes for 5 minutes. I can go back to that and make fun of you some more. John and I go back 100 years, so this is quick. The way the Commission frames its own mandate is the need to determine whether the marketplace is effectively competitive. And I think that's a wonderful word. I'm not used to praising the FCC as much as I'm about to in this talk. I don't know how they've gotten it so right, at least so far in this area, but they seem to have. Because by using the word effectively, they are signaling that they're not looking for perfect competition, the textbook model, understanding intuitively or more explicitly that perfect competition is great in the textbook, it's great on the blackboard, it's even applicable to a lot of industries, but probably not applicable to the industries of most concern to the FCC. So it's not a question of putting up regulation against a perfectly competitive backdrop. The issue is really whether competition is sufficiently effective. And sufficient for what purpose? Well, the way I've chosen to put it, and it's a little bit tautological, I think, is I'd like to understand competition as being sufficiently intense to make it unnecessary for the public interest and probably counterproductive to use extensive regulatory oversight. So competition is effective if public utility style regulation would actually be against the public interest in a setting like that. But okay, I'm not going to leave it there. That would be too tautological, because the next question is, how do we know what kind of a test should we use? So here's my favorite slide of these, and if I only get through this, I'll be pretty happy. Because I do have a proposal, and I am proud of my old age occasionally, and this is one of those times, because I've been using essentially this framework since some of you are pretty old too, I guess. You don't have to laugh. Going back to the days when deregulating long distance was an issue. Remember when they charged for long distances? It's really a long time ago. My students have no concept that once you had to pay for long distance voice, so it's just amazing to them. But it's essentially the same criteria. So the number one criterion on this list is, can consumers shop? Do consumers have alternatives? If their supplier pisses them off economically or in the 800 call center behavior of the supplier, can the consumer react and go someplace else? So that's question one, can consumers shop? Question two is whether suppliers are justifiably concerned about that. Now, they might or might not be. These are not give-me's at all, although if you know the wireless industry, you know very well what the answers are here. But in some markets, this is a real issue. Can consumers shop, and do suppliers worry about it because consumers can desert their current suppliers in sufficient numbers to make a real dent in the business? And if that is true, then the business is going to be motivated in the nastiest, greediest way to do as well as it can to please the consumer. And after all, that is what competition or effective competition is all about. So can consumers shop, and are suppliers sufficiently worried about that to allow it to affect their behavior in pro-consumer, pro-consumer welfare ways? So those are the two major precepts. And then since we're trying to be practical about it as well, what should be the legs of an empirical demonstration that these factors really do reign in the marketplace? And here there are three sub-bullets that you can see so far away. The first is whether there are lines of evidence of rivalry among the suppliers. And that, in a way, will be a condensation of those two precepts, because if we don't see rivalry, then we don't see suppliers reaching out to consumers to help them shop, and we don't see evidence of these suppliers being concerned about how well they're doing for their consumers. So we look to the marketplace to see evidence of active rivalry, both in terms of price and non-price dimensions, depending upon the character of the marketplace. And of course, in wireless today, no surprise, things can move for the non-price dimensions to our enormous pleasure if you like the devices in your pocket. Along with evidence of supplier-to-supplier rivalry, question is, do we see evidence of consumer movements in response? If the suppliers are doing these rivalrous things in the marketplace, you ought to be seeing consumers reacting to that if this is real, if we're not just seeing this through occluded glasses. So along with rivalrous actions, we want to see consumer movements that seem to be responding and showing that consumers can shop, not just because they're dissatisfied, but because they're being tempted by some marvelous outreach by some other supplier. So that's the first kind of empirical evidence that we should be looking for to check out those two precepts of what constitutes effective competition. Second, if this marketplace is working, we should be seeing evidence of diversity in terms of sources of supply. If suppliers are worried, then they're worried about other suppliers coming along. If consumers can move, they should be moving to others who have new things to offer, or at least diverse things to offer. So we should be seeing conditions of expansion, contraction, entry, and exit. And we should see the ability of new suppliers to have access to key inputs that they need to make a go of it in the marketplace. So evidence of the potential dynamic of the marketplace is the second leg of evidence. And third, if this is all working, we should see evidence that it is working. We should see consumer welfare and its signs increasing over time. We should see increasing output. However output is measured in this market, it should be increasing over time, or at least not decreasing. We should be seeing prices falling, or at least quality-adjusted prices falling. And we should see a never-ending pace of the kind of innovation that is responsive to the demands of consumers. So this is my schematic for how to judge effective competition in FCC-style markets. The marvelous thing, and it's a shocker to me, just in terms of general prejudice, is that having written that and thought about it, it actually seems to be consistent with the Commission's current approach. And who knows? I mean, there's always a surprise, you know? But to me, that's a wonderful surprise. And maybe it's because John was there, or because Jerry has been there, or maybe it's just random, who knows? Or maybe they listened to me 20 years ago. Who can say? I have no time right now to go into my description of what the Commission's framework is, but take it from me, it's pretty much in line. The words are a little bit different, but the ideas are really very much the same. I understand there is some, perhaps, possibility, one might say a threat, but only a threat an economist would regard as possibly mortal, and that is that the Commission may be moving away from what I regard as a perfectly appropriate framework for judging competition to a more formulaic, perhaps, reliance on these concentration statistics that we invented, last time we worked together, John? You know, Herfindahl's and stuff like that, or profit metrics like margins, price-cost margins, or total amount of profitability, things that are pretty conventional in other areas, although looked at with some degree of subtlety. But maybe the Commission and the NOI suggests wants to move somewhat in that direction. And what this slide lays out is all the reasons why that would be completely inappropriate, especially in the kinds of markets that are of specific interest to the FCC. First of all, because of the nature of the technology, economies of scale, scope, and density, we shouldn't be looking for Adam Smith-like competition. Lots of tiny little sheep farms in Old England. That's just not the character of this technology. We should expect to see some fair degree of concentration in these markets because of the economies of size. And so we shouldn't be designing policy to be skeptical of a market just because it is concentrated. Concentration may very well be an efficient reflection of the character of the technology. Second of all, when it comes to price-cost margins, well, any economist or self-critical accountant will recognize that when there are important fixed costs, common costs, joint costs, economies of scope, common infrastructure that supports the levy of different services, how one does the cost accounting is essentially very arbitrary, very difficult anyway. And certainly the conventional accounting-based measures of cost allocation really are economically inapplicable, although necessary, I suppose, for the auditors to do. What that means is conventionally measured price-cost margins at the level of the service don't mean anything. And so basing one's view of competition on formulas about price-cost margins is a totally inappropriate way to go about the business of the FCC. These markets are wildly dynamic, both on the supply side and the demand side. The products are changing even faster than the supply side technology, to our endless wonderment, if you're into that sort of thing. And that means that static measures of concentration are completely irrelevant to any sense of competitive significance or meaningful judgment about how competition is actually working. So the FCC really has it right, and moving in those directions, in a more formulaic direction, is really inappropriate backsliding and would be extremely unfortunate under the circumstances of the markets that the FCC has oversight on. So I'm sure my time is up, but let me just tell you very quickly that the facts and the public facts that you're probably all aware of in the wireless industry fit into this template very neatly and very appropriately and tell the story that this is a wildly competitive market, not just effectively competitive, but over the top effectively competitive. There's plenty of carriers, 4 nationwide carriers, 8 facilities-based carriers, 150 separate wireless licensees in the country. 94% of the population can choose where they live from at least 4 carriers. We focus on the rural areas, the lower tail of the density of the population in the U.S. Still, 3.6 carriers. That's a 0.6 carrier. I think I know one of those. I moved away from exercising my shopping ability the other day. AT&T on a bad day. No, I love my iPhone. I couldn't live without it. 3.6 carriers on average in the lower part of the density tail. And so that's a lot of competition, a lot of shopping opportunity for our consumers. There's lots of entry, lots of expansion, there's lots of jockeying back and forth in market shares, both nationally and locally. So real signs of dynamism. Prices have been falling on a per minute basis drastically until 06, 07. John, do you have the 08 data in your pocket? I won't get so prices for voice have been historically falling in very dramatic ways over the decade. Even prices of text messaging, which I know has been generating some controversy, not the per text message price, which seems to have gone through the roof, but if you use any of the plans that any sensible parent of any teenager in America will certainly invest in, then the per unit price of texting has become virtually free. We're up to 1 trillion text messages. Did you see that? So I think my daughter will be responsible for maybe 10% of that. That's just in a month. So I'm very grateful for these volumetric plans. The number of service plans and their configurations is always changing, and the scope of those plans seems to be ever enlarging. Just when you think they can't come up with anything else, they do. And handset prices, of course, have fallen amazingly so, and that the use of smartphones, which was a rarity just last year, has become extremely common. The suppliers are spending billions of dollars. The four majors are just all over the map in terms of their investments in advertising and upgrades of the network to accommodate the new technologies and advancing that technology. That's an inordinate amount of dynamic evidence of rivalry among the players, not only in price, but most pronouncedly in terms of features and the pricing of those features and the pricing of the handsets that deliver them. Enormous diversity, enormous spending to make things better and to compete and to grab those extra consumers. From the consumer point of view, and this is the big hit of the show as far as I'm concerned, so I'm glad they were letting me get here, 20% churn every year among consumers. And part of that is, I guess, number portability, although I think the churn numbers were huge even before portability. Well, you might say this means that we're fickle, we're crazy. It might mean that we just accept the latest deal and then we screw our carrier as soon as we can. It might mean we screw ourselves because we don't really know what our obligations are. I'm one of those. But you promised me for 2 years, Verizon says, and get a back-end charge. Whatever it is, we're churning like crazy. And what that means for the competitive analysis is that suppose you're a supplier and suppose you're really pissing off your consumers and so there's a lot of outflow, as usual, but suppose that you're not attractive to incomings. Then your business collapses by, say, 20% or more in 1 year. And your stockholders can't take that. You'll be fired in 2 minutes. So it's enormous pressure on you to make your offerings not only attractive to those who are using them now, but to incoming new consumers. Enormous shopping pressure on all the suppliers. They'd be out of business and totally nuts if they didn't pay attention and wake up screaming in their fear of that every business day. And that adds up to a wildly competitive environment, no matter how few the suppliers are. Floor is plenty, and no matter what the Herfindahl's look like. So that's the most impressive number of all of these. And my sense is that it must be driving all of the other numbers in terms of the falling prices and the extent of investment to keep the service offering attractive. Output is way up no matter how you do it. Subscribership, the volumetric use is huge and enormous and growing. And I'm way over my time, so let me just say that when it comes to the regulatory thoughts that are on the table, like suspicion of exclusivity, like AT&T on the iPhone, that is merely a spur to more competition. We have the Storm and the Droid and the Free, all because of the other carriers' reaction to that exclusivity. And so as economics teaches, frequently vertical exclusives are really spurs to competition. They don't mean that competition is being suppressed. It means that inadvertently, perhaps to AT&T and also to Apple, the market is actually stimulated by those kinds of arrangements. And we've been saying that all the time immemorial. Even when it comes to the precious inputs that John alluded to as a hypothetical, special access, which has had its problems in the past, in my view, does not seem to be an anti-competitive factor in this marketplace. The market is working. We couldn't have real impediments to competition from special access. We still see the kind of broad competition that we are seeing. Moreover, there seems to be a profusion of new sources of supply of special access type functionality. So again, there's no surprise that competition seems to be taking care of that area as well. And what other silly things are we seeing? Oh, some notion that maybe these apps are too exclusive, either to the carrier or to the phone, but the amount of competition in apps is just overwhelming. Just try to keep track of all the options available to yourself. Exclusivities make some sense in terms of integrated solutions. There's really nothing for us over the FCC to be frightened of in that area. So I'll get off, but I think the lasting thought that I want to leave with you is not these particular policy conclusions, although I think they are important, but the template about how to go about analyzing markets like this was something of value beyond just today's issues in wireless. They should be, I think, embraced by the FCC quite generally. I think they have been, and to the extent there's some danger of backsliding, FCC don't do it. So thank you.
The great thing about following Professor Willig in the presentation is you know you don't have to prepare your own slides because you won't be left enough time to do them, which was my plan, actually, so I appreciate it. And of course, it's always more interesting to hear him talk about topics than it is me to talk about topics. At least it is to me. It is fun one time a year at least to get bogged down in the merits for an hour and 15 minutes. And I think everybody's almost exhausted with that. And we can return to the standard business of policy making probably around 1:15. Go read Com Daily and see who's estimating downward sloping supply curves today. I'm sure it's going on. But I wanted to speak very briefly about what I think and what we've been focused on lately with the Phoenix Center when I'm not wielding my sword is what the big policy issue right now, what the major struggle I think the FCC faces today, and how the left hand appears not to know what the right hand is doing, or I think it's gotten to the point that the left hand doesn't want to know what the right hand is doing at the FCC. Perhaps the most important task for the Commission at present is expanding the availability of broadband service, and we can debate the benefits of that, but there's $7 billion sitting on the table, probably a little more than that when you deal with loans, programs, maybe $10 billion, I think I've heard the number come down. And this money is going to be spent to expand broadband deployment. Now, how do you expand broadband availability to people? Well, you make the finances of deploying broadband network better. It's fairly obvious, at least to the economist, it's fairly obvious. You increase the demand for it in some way, or the revenue flow from that. You reduce the cost of providing that service in some way. You increase the profitability of providing a service, and that may entail subsidization, which in this case we are probably looking at significant subsidization in a one-time event, which may be repeated later if we can keep the printing press running fast enough. Or we may end up taking the money we spend every year supporting the twisted pair copper wireline network and port that over to the provision of broadband service, which I think would be fairly wise. I think at some point we have to ask ourselves the question, if we continue to make it cheap to live in the hinterlands, how many times are we going to have to pay to build a network to people who live in the hinterlands? People use the Rural Electrification Act or process in this country as an example of what we should do for broadband, and I think, well, maybe we shouldn't, because now we've got to pay to run them broadband circuits because we paid to run them electricity circuits. If we hadn't done that, we'd live closer to town, and it'd be a lot cheaper to get them broadband. If proximity has its value and its benefits, maybe we should encourage proximity rather than encouraging geographic dispersion of the population. But on the one hand, the FCC is focused, and there are a very good group of people there who are trying to figure out how to get broadband expanded. We have Larry skipping over at the NGIA, trying to get the money deployed and least of it wasted as possible, which is a very difficult task. before him, but we're trying to get it deployed. We're trying to make the conditions for deployment better. On the other hand, we have proposals, many proposals, to punish providers of the underlying network through various forms of regulation. Network neutrality is an example. I think special access regulation is probably another example, and we've written 2 papers this year on special access. The second, I think, is quite an interesting piece on market definition. So we've got, on the one case, we need to improve the financial motivation for the deployment of network, and we're going to spend government money to do that. And on the other hand, we're trying to implement policies that make the financial prospects of deploying network worse. Okay, so what is the FCC to do? If you impose network neutrality in its severe forms, much like we see from the bills proposed, in a strict sense, a rule, then most likely you're going to make the networks less deployed. We've already seen it happen empirically. In the case of certainly in the case of the auction, 700 megahertz auction, we saw the spectrum sell under an open network standard for substantial price. But more importantly, when we saw what I thought were not extreme conditions in the BTOP plan, the major carriers refused to participate. So we effectively excluded the most efficient providers and the largest providers of broadband in this country by imposing a constraint that they now will, according to some of my discussions with some of them, refuse to participate even with local governments in the provision of service if the money is BTOP money. Because of they do not want to touch, they don't want the network to touch the requirements of the open access standards. Now, that's not to say we can't have a network neutrality policy. Certainly enough people think it's important that the FCC has to consider it and probably implement some sort of process. That process today involves a case-by-case adjudication. We've seen it implemented to some extent in the Madison River case. I'm not so sure that's exactly the right model, and I'm not so sure that the government didn't cause the problem to begin with. But we also saw it in the Comcast case, which has its own problems, as Marius mentioned. There are significant debate over what happened in that case. One thing we do know is that there was some untruthfulness, and I think in the end that was punished. But the issue was resolved. Today, we don't know what network neutrality is. The Phoenix Center has a definition of network neutrality. At least we've spoken about it in the past, and generally there's a void interconnection. Other people think different things. Okay? We don't know exactly what it is. So why in the world would we impose a rule that establishes what it is when we don't know what it is? And we have a process that effectively, so far, has dealt with it, and we certainly have no evidence, significant evidence, that people are behaving in a way that we would find offensive. Right? So until we observe that, there's really no reason to impose a strict rule, not to say that we wouldn't. If it were observed, certainly in an anti-competitive sense that I think every economist would agree, if the network was being used in an anti-competitive way, that some action should be taken, whether by the FCC or the Department of Justice. So I think the biggest problem that the FCC is going to face in the next year, certainly in February and on with its NPRM on network neutrality, is how to balance these two problems. One is, how do I get network deployed? How do I make it more attractive for firms to deploy network, while at the same time make it less attractive for firms to deploy network? That problem has to be resolved, and it's unclear how it will be resolved, but the history of regulation suggests probably not well. But perhaps the best way at this point is to continue to monitor behavior to maintain the threat of response, and when it does happen, to deal with it in a prompt manner as they do in the Cascades. And that's all I have to say today. Much of these topics have been covered in our work this year. A recent paper on rural broadband deployment under a congestion management standard, which I think may be problematic in FCC decisions forthcoming, showing that the very people we're trying to deploy network to will be differentially and discriminated against and differentially impacted by a standard that encourages a capacity solution for congestion rather than a management capacity solution. And that idea arose from conversation with a guy who provides rural broadband service, originally in a nonprofit environment. So it's a legitimate issue to be concerned about. That is not to say network neutrality is not an important issue. Obviously is, and the FCC should obviously have some sort of program, continual program evaluating. And that's what I've got. Jerry, you want to come up and ask a question?
Thank to all our panelists. I think quite stimulating and quite useful. Before we turn to questions, I will just take the liberty to underscore the importance, I think, of the contributions this morning. Looking at competition or looking at notions of effective competition in a very systematic, disciplined way is extremely important to the Commission's work. I would say fairly historically, that's always been true. But I think a very pragmatic reason why it's particularly important and timely is that the Commission is required by 3 pieces of legislation to prepare 3 competition reports annually by different statutes. One is on the state of competition in the wireless industry, as you gathered from Professor Miller. But the other 2 include media or cable industry, cable distribution industry, however you characterize it, which is required by the Cable Act of 1992. The third report is required by an amendment to the Communications Act to look at the state of effective competition in the commercial satellite services industry. There seems to be a current interest in making sure these reports are achieved with some consistency. Even, I think, very disciplined as to how these questions are raised, and an emphasis on a good empirical record to support that analysis. So this was very helpful this morning. I would hope that those attending this morning that have an interest in competition policy should take a hard look at these 3 areas and contribute to the Commission's work in this area. It certainly would benefit, I think, all of us. With that, I think first, any of our panelists wish to comment on the presentations. We will take several of those, and then we can go to that.
I would like to ask how, but actually, John specifically. No, but I'm going to phrase the question just for you. Quite apart from FCC processes, which have their own delicacies to you and to the rest of us, quite apart from that, do you have a view on whether net neutrality is fundamentally an economic issue, or is it something else? The kind of issue that economists could grapple with.
Oh, there are absolutely. There are a lot of important economic questions that are involved in thinking about that. I mean, there's implications of possible market failures that might limit innovation in applications, for example. transactions costs of contracting between applications providers and internet service providers when you have to negotiate, so will the internet, will the applications providers who might be working in their garage never be deterred, for example, there's also issues about, some of the ones that Marius was raising is whether permitting price discrimination on both sides of a two-sided market is a good thing or a bad thing. Then there's issue that George was highlighting, how do you ensure adequate incentives for investments and innovation in the network? And then there's issues about providing incentives for efficiencies in operating the network itself. Lots of good economic issues, all tied up with this.
And in both directions.
Yes, some
point one way, some point the other way.
Well, it depends on how you resolve them, but there are issues one would have to consider that the resolution of which could point one way or the other way. Thank you.
George, what do you think?
Well, sure. We've modeled a few problems, such as restricting the charging of upstream carriers for some type of preference. I think that that the networks are probably getting very close to being able to do that. It's not obvious why that would be a bad thing. And some of the bills that have been floated about prohibit a carrier from negotiating. Say, for example, if a carrier wanted to negotiate with Major League Baseball to provide a streamed game at a higher bit rate or a burst bit rate and pay for that.
Moves so slowly.
It does, but when you see the spit, you might want to see it actually go. But this creates a problem because you have instances where it may make more sense for a Major League Baseball and Comcast to get together, or AT&T and Verizon to get together and say, okay, we're going to make some arrangement, and there may be some fee or not some fee that occurs, and improve the delivery of it rather than trying to negotiate with 10 million customers to do it. So you have 3 agreements rather than millions of agreements. And it's obvious that it would be more efficient, I think, to have 3 rather than 10 million agreements, which seems to be the way the proposals encourage an inefficient outcome without ever observing a case of some anti-competitive motivation for charging an upstream provider. Further, I think a lot of the arguments for common carriage in the context of network neutrality are a bit misguided because in the end you could have different services as a common carrier as long as you made it generally available. You could have a big circuit and a not so big circuit, or a managed circuit and a not managed circuit, as long as you make it available. So it's not even obvious that those kinds of solutions solve any of the problems, which I think in the end network neutrality is an issue of broadcast, trying to keep the internet, which is a multi-user technology, from looking like a radio station, which can only do one thing at one time. And that's where most of the debate comes from, is a mentality that I don't like the media business, and I don't want the internet to become newspapers and televisions where I can't say whatever I want to whenever I want to because NBC owns it and I don't. So that's another
relevant this morning.
Yeah.
Any other comments?
Just a quick follow-up on George. I think it is worth emphasizing that the NPRM, the proposal does go beyond traditional common carrier regulation. And the common carrier regulation is you post tariffs, you can have differentiated offerings, different priority, different prices, different quality, and so on, as long as you make the offerings available to all. The proposed rule goes beyond that. It says the carriers, broadband carriers, may not charge content or application providers for prioritized access. So it goes beyond traditional notions of non-discrimination. It's worth noting.
I actually have question for Bobby, if I can't. Can't wait. But so it's about your effective competition test. So I want to just give you some hypothetical facts and tell me whether that's effective competition or not. So we have prices declining, but the reason is that there are exogenous reductions in cost. And so you're seeing higher output and consumer benefits, but it's not because of rivalry. In fact, what the firms are actually doing is they're not pursuing strongly existing customers. They'll take customers who want to switch, but they are, and some do, for all sorts of reasons. So you do see some churn, but and maybe they're competing for new customers with discounts, but it's not all that much. It's not like the market is really growing so rapidly that that's the dominant story. So you'll have choice. Consumers will have choice. You'll see some switching. You'll see declining prices. You'll see consumer welfare going up. But there's not actually serious rivalry. Is that going to, in the sense of the solution concept being real aggressively competitive in the industry? So would you call that effective competition under your definition or not?
Well, I think you're quite right that if there's pronouncedly no signs of rivalry among the firms, but just exogenous conditions happen to be propitious, then an important leg of the test that I was articulating is missing. The signs of rivalry are really important. And the signs of rivalry linked to consumers reacting to them, and then causally, or one result being the improvement of service quality, dynamic innovation, or prices going down and output rising, all becomes part of the quilt, which all fits together. If a key leg like signs of rivalry is absent, I think the quilt is very much weakened, and I wouldn't be jumping to the same conclusion.
You had a little bit of my example. You had some churn, and you had some going after new customers with discounts. Enough that somebody could say that there's signs of rivalry, but I'm trying to postulate that it isn't really that much.
So, and if we're debating about any of the legs of the test, it's going to be a debate. Okay. But we need them all, I think. Yeah.
Further comments? Let's turn to the audience. We have time for a few questions. Professor Mail.
This is actually a question that was provoked by Bobby's comment, but then it really belongs to the panel in light of the last remark. Bobby, what you did is articulate a very common and well-accepted standard for effective competition in applying a regulatory test, and then went through a set of data, cursorily, but went through it, that pointed toward what you described as, and we added an adjective, wildly effective competition. And allow, especially in light of the last comment, that some people may put a different new name out in front of effective competition, mildly effectively competitive. And so the question to the panel is, if you were in a position of saying, well, let's allow that policymakers want to do something affirmative to enable more competition. Whatever the status of competition is, they want to enable more of it. Are there things that you, the panel, might recommend be done affirmatively, whether it involves simply getting out of the way or facilitating enhanced spectrum? What might you suggest to policymakers at this point?
Well, I'll take the easy part of the answer first and then hand off for the harder parts. I mean, we've been very proactive as a community in the last few years, and successfully so. Number portability has really helped consumers shop, there's no doubt about it. And the more consumers can shop without having dislocation costs borne personally, like when you have to change a number, really helps consumers to shop, and therefore helps to bring the fear of customer loss to the suppliers, which is what the competitive discipline is all about. So that was a good, proactive, aggressive, pro-competitive move. And on the supply side, more spectrum, more availability, more flexibility and deployment of spectrum, and I think we have been moving in that direction, is very good for entry dynamics and for expandability of the smaller carriers. So I think we got some big hits on both the demand side and the supply side, but where things are going further, I leave to others. John?
I'm going to view myself here as the policymaker to whom these comments are suggested, rather than the person who's kind of explaining things to myself. So why don't you go ahead?
Well, I think you got to be real careful with policy. You can't, as I think everybody has mentioned here, you can't just have an infinite number of telecom providers. There's a limit. And you can work very, very hard and do lots of things and still not get another firm. But if you do some things in the process, you may lose a firm. It's very delicate. I think that the risk of having more firms, or having fewer firms, is much larger than the risk of having more firms from policy intervention at this point in time. Okay, the thing, it's weighted towards exit. And you can, a lot of people say, well, we need more spectrum. Well, throwing out more spectrum out there, it does not mean you're going to get more firms. Okay, we've had exit from the wireless industry over the past 10 years. Okay, we had more of them, but they're leaving because it wasn't financially sustainable to have 6, 7, 8 wireless carriers in the United States. Okay, and it's not even clear that the current equilibrium is stable. So you got to be real careful how you can push competition too hard in this industry and end up with monopoly. Okay, if it becomes Bertrand-like in the face of fixed cost, you're going to end up with monopoly. So you got to be a little careful. But I think what I recommend to policymakers is always get the log out of your own eye and get out of the way. Okay, this broadcasting thing interests me because I read the paper about the value of the broadcast spectrum to the wireless industry versus to the broadcast industry, and it was some gazillion-dollar difference. And to an economist, you just go, well, I wonder why they haven't sold it to them yet, right? And why are we arguing about it at the FCC? They ought to just sit down at a table and do a deal, but they can't do a deal because the FCC won't let them do a deal. You can't have a market in spectrum because at any given time, the FCC could walk in and say, I want it back. Okay? And if you do a deal with somebody and go, hey, I'm not using this, do you want it? Then you just said, hey, I'm not using this, and you might get it taken back from you. So fix the regulation first. That's the easiest thing to do. Changing market structure is a bear.
Okay, Larry tells me we are running short of time. Let's take one quick question. Yes, and the mic's coming, and that will have to conclude the panel.
Cass Calba, Calba International. My question is, I'm trying to expand the spatial and temporal dimensions here a little bit. Let's assume for purposes of discussion that the market is relatively competitive, and particularly in areas of applications and innovation, it's moving very well. Why has it taken this long for that to occur, given that internationally you can point to Japan in the 90s and you can point to Europe in the late 90s and the early part of this decade, and make a reasonable argument that there was more innovation, more service choices, more applications that were being introduced to the market there. You can also make an argument that now, the United States has sort of regained the leadership in a lot of these areas. But why did it take this long? Was it something on the policy side? Was it I don't think it was number portability, because those other markets didn't have that. And if you look at spectrum, there's a mixed picture. Was it because we had too many operators? Was it something else?
I think Cass knows the answer.
Yeah, Cass probably does know the answer. You do a lot of work on wireless. Since I was a kid, I remember wondering why the Japanese had televisions in their pockets. They're always technologically ahead of the United States. It's a cultural thing. It's a state-owned enterprise. It's certainly been for most of history, and I think still is to a large extent. And they subsidize a lot of innovation in technology to support their economy. So I don't I'm not a big fan of looking to certainly Asian economies and wondering why the U.S. economy hasn't caught up. It's not clear that the U.S. Consumer will buy it. Also, in the U.S., if you're going to make an investment like that, you got to make money on it. I mean, nobody's going to bet well. In the old days, no one would bail you out, and the banks aren't in the telecom business, so maybe it's still true. But and people make international comparisons all the time, and the thing that bothers me about them is that very few people know what they're talking about when they do. I mean, you can't pick up the newspaper and know what's going on in Denmark. You got to go to Denmark. And every time I fly or travel internationally, I'm never impressed with the broadband and the technology. Never. I mean, when we went to Portugal, it was interesting because there, talking about the wireless issue, there they